How do you hide dead children? How do you hide orphaned children? Razed neighborhoods? Leveled refugee camps? How do you hide dead journalists and destroyed hospitals? How do you hide the eradication of entire bloodlines? How do you hide bombs and starvation? How do you hide executions and torture? How do you hide a genocide?
The boys say, we didn't do anything wrong.
Babies engulfed by blankets and wires. At least 10 have died from a lack of food at this hospital.
Then suddenly another commotion. A tiny bundle rushed in, a little baby, his face grey from the dust, one leg ripped off.
هؤلاء الأطفال تم إخراجهم من داخل مدرسة الزهراء بعد قصفها وتدميرها من قبل
9 reservist soldiers accused of sexually assaulting a detainee.
In a manner similar to, but much more explicit than, the manufacturing of the threat posed by Saddam Hussein in the lead up to the 2003 Iraq War, the US news media has manufactured a story about and since October 7th that obfuscates Israeli and American war crimes against Palestinians. I'm Sana Saeed, and I want to talk about how the US news media has erased, hidden, and justified the US-backed Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people. In the first part of this video, I'm going to discuss the impact of the genocide itself. Then in the second part, I'm going to examine the main methods used in the coverage over the first 3 months to construct the story we were told while the reality on the ground was silenced. Let's first discuss the depth of the horrors being experienced by Palestinians. At the time of filming, it has been 360 days, over 11 months, since the Israeli war on Gaza began. To date, the official number of Palestinians killed by the US-backed Israeli campaign of genocide, including in the West Bank, totals over 40,000. However, healthcare officials and studies estimate that the actual number of Palestinians killed by bombs, starvation, and disease is likely upwards of 100,000, with some estimates even putting it at over 200,000. That's 10% of Gaza's population. As early as November 2023, even the Biden administration itself recognized that the official numbers were too low.
We think they're very high, frankly, and it could be that they're even higher than are being cited. We'll know only after the guns fall silent.
Of the Palestinians killed in Gaza, over 40% are believed to be children. UNICEF called Gaza a quote-unquote graveyard for children 3 weeks into the genocide. In the West Bank, where Israel has also extended its genocidal campaign, the IDF has killed Palestinian children at a rate of 1 every 2 days since October 7th. And over 20,000 children are believed to be missing in Gaza. Entire neighborhoods have been razed, mosques and churches destroyed, and thousands of years of cultural heritage have been erased. Of the 370,000 homes in Gaza, 80,000 have been completely destroyed, with the UN estimating that it would take over 80 years to rebuild these homes, not taking into account those that have been damaged. 90% of Palestinians have been displaced, ethnically cleansed from their homes. Life-sustaining infrastructure has been completely destroyed by the Israelis, from waste management to healthcare, education, and water systems. Almost 200 Palestinian journalists and media workers, the only ones able to document the genocide, have been killed, often in clearly targeted airstrikes. Tens of thousands of Palestinians are suffering from starvation and disease that will, according to most predictions, inevitably kill them. And then there are reports of systematic mass sexual violence by the IDF against Palestinians held in Israeli prisons and torture camps. In just the first 100 days, the US-backed Israeli war on Palestinians had already become the deadliest and most destructive war of the 21st century, bringing in the highest daily rate of death. In addition to all of this, the Israeli state and military apparatus have also carried out deadly violence in the West Bank, where state-armed settler violence has increased and military raids across refugee camps have been deadly, including claiming the lives of US citizens Tawfiq Abdul-Jabbar and Ashanur Ezgi Egi. Throughout the genocide, numerous Israeli officials, such as Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, as well as members of the Israeli media and rank-and-file soldiers, have made open calls for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the total annihilation of Palestinians. From making biblical references about the legitimacy of killing women and children, to arguing about the non-existence of the innocence of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, to offering to push Palestinians into the Egyptian Sinai as a humane measure, there has been a repetition of intent, the intent for genocide. But none of this violence against Palestinians by the Israelis would be possible without the support, financial, political, and military, of the Americans.
The U.S. is now surging supplies, weapons, and air defenses to Israel.
President Biden greenlighting billions of dollars worth of weapons for Israel.
The Biden administration is planning to send $1 billion in weapons to Israel.
Amid the rising tension, the U.S. tonight approved $20 billion in arms sales to Israel.
The United States has supported the Israeli targeting of Palestinian hospitals, denied that Israel has been targeting civilians, and called Palestinians unreliable in their cataloging of civilian casualties.
Well, we all know that the Gazan Ministry of Health is just a front for Hamas. It's run by Hamas, a terrorist organization. I've said it myself up here. We can't take anything coming out of Hamas, including the so-called Ministry of Health, at face value.
Instead of applying pressure on Israel to scale back its campaign, as it did eventually in previous Israeli assaults on Gaza, the United States has instead opted to continue pushing for increased and continued bombardment. It has even repeated Israeli propaganda talking points regarding the killing of its own citizens.
Well, apparently it was an accident, ricocheted off the ground, and it got hit by accident, but I'm working that out now.
Throughout the U.S.-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza, the U.S. news media has chosen to remain muted on the atrocities and on the direct role the United States is playing in the oversight of the genocide. Instead, it has manufactured distractions and stories that have kept the scale of the U.S. and Israel's murderous campaign in Gaza hidden. The first 3 months of coverage are critical to understanding how the U.S. news media was able to obfuscate and justify the genocide of Palestinians. And here's how it was done. First, it started with the construction of the foundational narrative that served to justify everything and anything Israel would do following the Hamas-led attacks on October 7th. Israel, the U.S. government, other Western governments, and the U.S. news media rooted the events of that day in the memory and the violence of the Holocaust and 9/11, evoking genocide and attacks on quote-unquote freedom-loving people.
It's killed more Jews than really any other attack since the Holocaust.
The worst attack against Jews since a Holocaust.
It's being called a 9/11 moment for Israel.
That is why October 7th is another day that will live in infamy.
There was no questioning of Israel's official narrative of the events that day, which claimed over 1,200 Israeli lives, including 800 civilians and 400 soldiers. Claims about beheaded babies, mass rapes, and unspeakable horror were reported without verification. In fact, to this day, there has been near zero critical engagement with the official Israeli narrative of October 7th in the U.S. news media, despite critical reporting in Israeli English and Hebrew language press, which continues to investigate the IDF's role in killing its own people. After establishing the day one narrative justifying the Israeli onslaught of violence against Palestinians, there was then the move towards justifying the targeting and attacking of life-sustaining infrastructure such as hospitals and schools. To do this, the Israelis and Americans had to establish Palestinians as untrustworthy witnesses to their own genocide. On October 17th, 10 days after the start of the genocide, the Al-Ahli Arab Hospital was bombed. While initial video and witness reports claimed it was an Israeli airstrike, and news outlets immediately published this, within hours Israel claimed it was a failed rocket launch from a Palestinian militant group.
The IDF said that they are looking into the incident, that it could potentially have been a Hamas misfire.
And what followed were days and weeks of debate about who did it.
At around 6:59 p.m. local time, 4 cameras captured the moments before and after the incident.
This is what typically you would see if there was an IDF strike, even as large as 19 meters, a much larger crater.
Al Jazeera digital investigations team found no grounds to the Israeli army claim.
During this period, we see President Joe Biden call Palestinians liars.
I have no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using.
And we see the proliferation of the term Hamas-run Ministry of Health. Immediately, any and all claims made by Palestinians were rendered questionable before they could even be heard. So we have the foundational narrative locked in and Palestinians rendered unreliable witnesses. And both of these things were critical to making Palestinians legitimate targets for Israeli and American violence. And while this is happening throughout October 2023, there's another story that's being constructed on the domestic front: anti-Semitism. As Americans of all different backgrounds begin filling their streets and campuses, marching against the US-backed Israeli war on Palestinians, we see an immediate demonization of language. Words like decolonization, liberation, from the river to the sea, and martyr are fear-mongered about and condemned by both politicians and the news media, rendering any and all protests akin to anti-Semitic pogroms. Words and peaceful, even if enraged protests are made into a form of violence, while actual violence against Arabs and Muslims in this country is, at best, brushed aside, made non-existent. Throughout October, images and footage out of Gaza were only able to spread through social media platforms and channels like Al Jazeera because the Israelis closed the territory off to any journalists not already inside. A year later, that's still the case, unless you're embedded with the IDF itself. So we have restricted media access and a news media that's already entirely deferential to the Israelis. All we are getting in October is a narrative that has been completely constructed by the Israelis, blessed by the Americans, and unquestioned by the news media in this country. November builds on the propaganda of October. Whereas the bombing of Al Ahli Arab Hospital created the grounds for legitimizing hospitals as targets, the focus in November becomes the Al Shifa Hospital, Gaza's largest hospital. Immediately, American news coverage devotes itself to legitimizing the Palestinian healthcare system in Gaza as a target, as Israel claims, without any evidence, that a Hamas command center sits under Al Shifa.
We do have information that Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad uses some hospitals in the Gaza Strip, including the Al Shifa Hospital, as a way to conceal and support their military operations and hold hostages.
And of course, ultimately, all the Israelis really ever found under Shifa was a calendar. Throughout October and November, alongside the story of anti-Semitism, the events of October 7th, and hospitals and schools as legitimate targets for bombs, there is, of course, a focus on Israeli hostages, whose families become mainstays in coverage. But by December, even the focus on the hostages begins to wane as the situation on the ground in Gaza worsens. And that's when we see a pivot to a story that had been hinted at back in October: mass rapes of Israeli women. Now, they didn't happen. There is no evidence of systematic mass rapes of Israeli women on October 7th by Palestinian groups. But that doesn't stop both the US political establishment and the news media from going all in on this story, which sees its first major spotlight in the now debunked New York Times article, Screams Without Words, published on December 28th. And so as our news media created all of this noise, the Israelis, given a carte blanche by the Biden administration, embark with ease on annihilating the Palestinians. Never mind that the Israelis stopped aid from reaching Palestinians in order to starve them. Never mind the repeated massacres of displaced Palestinians. Never mind the spread of disease, the ICJ ruling, or the sexual, physical, and psychological torture of Palestinians in torture camps. Never mind all of that. Israel, we are told again and again, has a right to defend itself. Because look at October 7th, look at these hostages, look at how you can't trust Palestinian claims, look at these rapes. Of course, there are many more ways in which the media obfuscated genocide. the use of exonerated passive voice to shift blame away from Israel, the constant framing of President Joe Biden as weak and beholden to Benjamin Netanyahu versus being the most powerful man in the world who could end the genocide with a single phone call. There has also been the coverage of campus protests as hotbeds of anti-Semitism, the coverage of UNRWA, the complete dismissal of UN warnings and reports on Israeli war crimes, and the complete erasure of Palestinian journalists, their work, and their humanity. But those first 3 months, they were critical in establishing the base narrative to dehumanize Palestinians to the point of annihilation. Instead of doing basic journalism, our news media in this country opted to become a committed wing of both the US and Israeli governments. Instead of doing journalism, our news media has decided that the claims of those who bomb and incinerate children in tents matter more than the children in those tents. And there is a profound immorality and tragedy in a free press that voluntarily enmeshes itself with the power of the state so that it can partake in the burning of the flesh of civilians it has agreed are not human enough to be allowed to live.